Welcome to the most important week of the year for the podcast industry. Welcome to Podcast Movement 2025.
All right. Well, thank you all for showing up today. My name's Michael Osborne. I run a production and consulting company in Austin called 14th Street Studios. We specialize in helping launch a number of different shows. We really specialize in creative development. My clients tend to be indie creators, brands, as well as mission-driven organizations. And my talk today is about from indie to industry, crafting a podcast that attract major media partners. So I want to give a little bit more of an introduction, and let me start by saying that I'm probably going to talk a lot in the first person, but none of what I'm going to tell you is a single person story. Everything I've ever worked on is with a team, usually two, 3, or 4 people. I always loved this meme for how to introduce oneself on a podcast. So hello, my name is Michael Osborne. My backstory is that I did a PhD at Stanford once upon a time, and in a fit of desperation, I started a podcast that began my audio journey. I've created 3 original shows, and they've all wound up attracting major media partners. So in 2014, I signed a deal with Smithsonian Magazine for my first show, Generation Anthropocene. It was a long-form conversation show. My second show was Narrative, Raw Data. In 2019, we ended up partnering with PRI. And then my most recent show, Famous and Gravy, last year signed a deal with Wondery. And let me just say that signing a deal with Wondery sure looked a little different 3 weeks ago. I don't know if you all know the news, but Wondery there's been a major reorg. But I do think that an indie show attracting a major media partner like this, hopefully speaks for itself. So, I kind of want to lay out the problem here. And by the way, my slides are a mess. They're probably not going to be very easy to follow, but they help me remember what I have to say. So challenge number 1 for an indie creator, if you want to attract a media partner, is that we are not famous. If you're a celebrity, it's a lot easier to land a major media partnership. Most of us, are either nobodies or a person of repute at best. The second problem is that we've got limited budgets. We're not rich. So really the challenge here that I want to try and speak to today is how do you create an industry-worthy show with no pre-existing audience, limited time, and a limited budget? When you frame it like that, it's kind of we're up against a lot here. So let me start by saying I'm not exactly sure how I managed to do this 3 times, but there is a bit of a pattern here. So as I've been getting ready for this talk, I've been thinking, what were the things that were true with every media partnership that I attracted? What kind of pattern matching can I do? So, and let me say this first. What I'm about to share, it's going to start with kind of table stakes. Like, this is what you have to be doing at a bare minimum. There's a lot more you have to be doing, but let's start with things that are essential. So thing number 1, dial in your production process. Your show needs to be humming like a machine. You need to know how every episode is being produced, created, and released. That's kind of obvious. Point number 2, you're at this conference, so hopefully this is pretty self-evident. We networked like crazy. Something I like to say, there's nobody too high or too low on the totem pole to be networking with. You never know when somebody might drop your show into a Slack channel at work somewhere. 3, we sorted out our IP. There's a couple of lawyers who hang around this conference. They're great guys, and I really recommend sorting out your IP if this is really a fantasy you have of one day attracting a media partner. At some point, somebody's going to ask, who owns this thing anyway? I learned that one the hard way. A 4th point here is, in every case, we had aligned our show with the editorial mission of the media partner. That was kind of the result of networking. So with Wondery, for example, we knew that they were very interested in history. My second show, Raw Data, we knew that they were very interested in science and technology. This 5th point is really the one I'm going to dive deep into for the rest of the talk, which is that we kept improving our show on all of them, even after we'd launched it. I think that there is this idea for independent creators that, hey, I've created a great show, it's up and running, how do I grow it? How do I bring in more audience? And we don't turn our gaze inward enough to say, how do we make an even better show? So that's really the main message I want to hammer home for the rest of the talk. I will say that another key pattern here is that all of the partnerships that I managed to attract, they all emerged. It took about 3 years between when the show launched and when we actually signed a deal, and they all actually came after a production pause. So one thing to think about is that don't be afraid of a production pause if you need to stop and reassess, how is my show doing? Okay, I figured I'd reinvent the wheel.
We're getting interference.
Oh, is that better? Okay, hopefully that's better. Okay, so I reinvented the wheel. This is a kind of process for how to go about thinking about creative development, because if you really want to attract a media partner, you've got to have not just like a good idea for a show, but a great idea for a show. And again, that is not done just because your show is live in the world. So I'm going to walk you through what this looks like. I'm going to use my most recent show, Famous and Gravy, as a case study. And this is kind of the timeline of events. My partner Amit and I started talking about this show back in the fall of 2020. We launched it in 2021, and we signed the deal with Wondery 3 years later. So our show, and let me say this about Famous and Gravy, because as a creator, it's always tempting to be like, you really need to listen to my show. You don't need to listen to my show. I mean, I hope you do. It's an awesome show. I'm going to talk a lot about it today. But my point in taking you into it is not to sell you on my podcast. It's to take you inside the creative development process, because I think we did something very cool and original and interesting here. Okay, it all began with Amit and I had this thing where we would text each other to the names of dead celebrities. So this morning I texted Amit and I said, Tim Curry, dead or alive. Amit and I actually built an app to promote the show, Dead or Alive, Tim Curry, if you don't know. So Tim Curry, dead or alive? The point is you had to think about it. I'm happy to say Tim Curry is still with us at age 79 as of this recording. We got a whole app with like hundreds of names in this. Play it, Famous and Gravy, or I'm sorry, deadoralive.com, app.com. All right. So step one is inspiration. Amit and I had this idea, let's do a dead celebrity podcast. And for me, there is an adage I've heard that great art begins with mimicry. So I don't know if you guys saw this Time Magazine 100 Greatest Podcasts of All Time. There's another one floating around here that I think has a lot of overlap with this list. I thought this list was exceptional. I was really, really impressed with all of the podcasts that showed up. Like, bravo, Time Magazine. So as Amit and I were thinking about, like, what's a dead celebrity podcast going to look like, the first thing we did was start collecting some of our favorite shows. I have a bit of a framework for how I think about great podcasts. And regardless of format or category or anything else, I think all great podcasts have three elements in common. Great story, learning, that you learn something that you didn't know ahead of time, and then hangout space, parasocial relationships. So I think that's a decent framework for thinking about what makes a great show and what's the show that we're attracted to, right? So this inspiration piece is really about you becoming a student of the medium. All right, so there's 5 shows that I'm going to draw attention to that were really critical for us with Famous and Gravy. The first one is rewatchables. If you don't know this show, what they do is they take an old movie, they rewatch it. It's all based on categories and segments. So structurally, we were really interested in that idea. There's all these categories that are driving the show. It culminates in this question, who won the movie, which is sort of an interesting, conversation starter driving question. And so we're really into it. Like, we were asking ourselves, what works about this show? Another show you're wrong about, I don't know if you all know this one, I'm a big Michael Hobbs fan. Kind of the gist of this show is that it's usually a deconstruction, or how would I say it? It's usually there's a story we remember, a news story from the past, and our memory of that story is inaccurate, incomplete, or biased. Couple others I'll mention real quickly. Doug Loves Movies. This is not in the Time Top 100, but it's a fun show. Vicarious pop culture games with friends. And then Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me and Heavyweight. Heavyweight for me is the number one. I think Heavyweight's the best podcast of all time. That's probably what I'd put on my list. And I'll come back to those in just a little bit because they're going to come up again. Okay. So step 3, experimentation. So we've got our shows. We've begun to deconstruct how do they work. And really the 2 we landed on the hardest were rewatchables and You're Wrong About. Essentially, Famous and Gravy is rewatchables meets You're Wrong About, except for dead celebrities. So we had this idea that we wanted to take this category-based approach to a show built on segments. And I don't want to go too deep into Famous and Gravy, but I do think that my hope here is that the creative development process will kind of get the wheels turning for you for how do I take a good show and make a great show. So the two elements I want to draw attention to are categories 2 and 3. So category 2 is where we say, we grade the first line of the New York Times obituary. That's a kind of surrogate for the story you think you know. The second category, 5 Things I Love About You, is where we have a subjective interpretation of a dead celebrity's story. And so it kind of like you're wrong about, we begin to create a gap between what you think you know and a different way of analyzing a life, a biography. The show culminates in this category, The Vanderbeek, named after James Van Der Beek in Varsity Blues, I Don't Want Your Life. That is a meme, it's out there. Every time I hear it, I still giggle at it. On our show, we ask this question, would you want that life? Again, it's a thought experiment and a driving question. Okay, so the last step is probably the most important. And again, we did all of this kind of like brute force experimentation as hobbyists, just like playing around. We ended up doing a test audience survey before we launched. So we ended up producing 4 episodes, sent them out to friends and family and said, what do you think? And we got some real important feedback. They said, thing number 1, you have got to do more research on your show. At the time, Amit and I were mostly just going to Wikipedia and YouTube a little bit, and they said, if you want your show to have credibility, you're gonna have to, do a little bit more homework. They also, our test audience also flagged the issue of representation, that most of what we were featuring was, white men on the show, and they said that's not good enough. But the most important thing is I said, overall, this concept is compelling and promising, and you ought to launch it. So in winter of 2021, we launched Famous and Gravy. So that's the end of chapter 1. That was all the work we did to get the show up and off the ground. These were the first 3 episodes. Robin Leach of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, that was episode 1. Then Vidal Sassoon and Leonard Nimoy was episode 3. Don't go back and listen to those. They're pretty rough around the edges. I mean, I'm proud of them. I'm glad we put them out there. But I made this point earlier that the minimum viable product, the show that's ready for launch, is not the show that's ready to be industry worthy. So chapter 2, here's a few highlights of some of the episodes we did between winter of 2021 and before signing with Wondery in 2024. So this is like 2 years at least of continued experimentation and refining of the show. We went back to that process, that inspiration, deconstruction, experimentation, solicitation. So the second phase of things, and I really got to credit Amit Kapoor with saying this show is not done. We are not there. Our central message is not clear. And I don't think we need to keep working on it. So 2 shows that really came up during this second chapter of creative development were Pivot. One thing that is baffling to me about Pivot is that I can't stand either of these people individually. Like Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher annoy the hell out of me individually, but together, there's something about their dialogue, their chemistry, their analysis that really works for me. And I like them more now because of each other. But so that host chemistry and their sort of hot takes were things that were real points of inspiration for us. The other show is another Michael Hobbs show, If Books Could Kill. It's got a snarky aesthetic. The tagline is, the airport books that won our hearts and ruined our minds. That had some real similarities with Famous and Gravy because they are kind of playing with a common genre, in their case, nonfiction, in our case, biography. And so we did a little bit more deconstruction with those shows and tried to incorporate those elements into our podcast, into Famous and Gravy. We went back to the structure. This is, again, Famous and Gravy is a highly structured show. Every episode, we go through these segments. And I didn't say this earlier, but these first 2 categories, grading the first line of the obit and 5 Things I Love About You, I mean, every subsequent category is essentially a subset of the question, would you want that life? It's a different way of probing into the desirability. I mean, the whole philosophy here is celebrity is a kind of mirror. And if we turn it back on ourselves, there's something we can learn about who we are. That was an idea that we learned and arrived at through all this work. Okay, so we introduced a few new categories, but there's one I want to draw attention to. There's a reason it's in green highlight, the Vanderbeek. We revised the Vanderbeek. It used to be the question, do you want this life, yes or no? It was a yes or no binary. We were serving as judge and jury of a biography of a dead celebrity. Again, a thought experiment. We changed this so that we are no longer judge and jury, we are now the defense attorney. We cut the argument in half. We are only now, at the end of the show, presenting the case for why you should want this life. That, to me, is a real, subtle, but very important adjustment because it means on every episode we are making the case for hope and redemption and why life is meaningful and worthy in ways that we don't recognize. That matters because I think that take any podcast you love, you actually know how you're going to feel before you hit play. That there is a certain kind of predictability in the podcast we love, which I think is a kind of hard thing to design. Think of, again, let me say that again. You know how you're going to feel before you listen to it. That's kind of confusing, right? So it's not just about consistency of production schedule. It's about consistency of emotion. It's about the value proposition of your podcast being the same value proposition episode to episode. This revised Vanderbeek category satisfies that criteria. There's one more part that I want to draw attention to. This is my little hack for indie creators. Okay, so if you've been around this conference a little bit and people have been saying, you have got to get audience research. You've got to find out what your audience wants. Yes, but that's actually really, really hard, especially if you've got a small show with a few dozen, a few hundred people. How the hell do you hear from these people? Here's a little hack I have to offer. So we developed this listener call-in segment on Famous and Gravy. I begin every episode where I pluck clues from the obituary, and I create a little quiz where I give the clues to a guest, somebody who calls in, and we slowly reveal who this person is. These segments were inspired by these two podcasts, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the whole Bluff the Listener thing, and Heavyweight, where every episode begins with him calling and messing with Jackie's head. This clue happens to be the Leslie Nielsen episode. It's a lot of fun. So his brother was Prime Minister of Canada. He was a Canadian Air Force gunner and, was cast as a clueless doctor in the movie Airplane. All right. So I have this little segment. I get to hear from my audience, but the really important part is that I use that as an opportunity to ask, after I record the quiz, and I'm recording all of this on Squadcast, I'll say, hey, do you have a second to hang around and just talk about the show? And I've got 5 questions that I'll ask my audience every time I have an opportunity to talk to them. These were all stolen from Tom, I say stolen, these were all inspired by Tom Webster and his book, The Audience is Listening. So, how did you hear about the show? Whatever process they went through to discover the show, I want to repeat that process. How do you describe it to your friends? I have my language for how I describe my show. Biographies from a different point of view. Every episode we asked, would you want that life? I need to hear it from them because they are my cheerleaders. They're out there telling other people what my show is all about. What other shows are you into? I want to get into the behaviors and habits of my audience. I want to understand, what else do you like? And who else might I partner with as an independent if I want to draw attention to it? Would you make it longer or shorter? So rather than saying, is it too long? I'm wondering if the show holds attention. And then finally, a kind of open-ended question, how can I make this a better show? Some of the insights that have come from this little hack of using a listener call-in segment to have one-on-one conversations with my audience. Turns out mostly Gen X book lovers. They describe the show as lit. I don't know what lit means. I had to look it up, but I have a lit show, apparently. A lot of people come to Famous and Gravy because they are fatigued on the news and they are tired of true crime. They feel a little bit sleazy listening to too much true crime. So we seem to appeal to people who are, news consumers, but have gotten a little too in their head about the fact that the world's burning down. They're looking for something fun but smart. And something I've also learned is that every show has a fringe audience and a core audience. And what's sort of subversive and for me creatively exciting about Famous and Gravy is that it is a fun show. If you've never listened, if you were to go and hit play, you're like, yeah, it's fun and entertaining. But after you listen to 3 episodes or more, you're like, oh, there's actually more to it than that. So there is this acquired taste to the show. And then they say that for whatever reason, our show seems to bring out the humanity. Like all this stuff I did not know about this person. So, there's some real sort of, important values that underlie our approach. And my audience is telling me that they're experiencing that. And then they say, this show is a biography. I actually really appreciate the structure and the thought you've put into it. Okay, so to sort of summarize what we brought to the deal with Wondery, we had a dialed-in, cost-effective, and I'll come back to that, cost-effective production process. We had sorted out our IP. We had hired a lawyer and made sure that we knew who owned the show, who's responsible for what. It cost some money, but not too much. It was reasonable. We had talked to the folks at Wondery and had a real idea of their editorial priorities. I didn't mention this. We'd also applied for and won 2 Signal Awards, which, I think awards are good for building reputational capital. So I encourage people to apply to awards. Shout out to Gemma. Okay, and then this is, I think, the most important thing. We knew our audience. Even though we were a small show, at this point, our downloads, per episode, were really in the hundreds. We had a very, very, very modest following. And this was not, by any means, a full-time job, even though it sort of had full-time preoccupation. But we were able to describe who this audience is, what this show is doing for them, and why we'd be a good partner. So I wanted to have one slide that simplified everything. This disaster of a slide is where this is kind of the whole story of the show. This creative development process existed before the launch and after the launch. The figure down here at the bottom is where we hit 100 download, and that's cumulative. So it took us 28 months to hit about 100,000 downloads. It took us another 5 to hit 200. It took us another 6 to hit 300. We're on our way to 4. So right now our show's in about tens of thousands, rough category. So it's not breaking the bank and it's not paying the bills, but we are revenue positive, which I'm very, very proud of. What a disaster of a slide. Okay, so, and here are some episodes I can't help but plug the podcast. So I'm very proud of the Fred Rogers episode. I think is a particularly good one to start with. These are all great. I honestly stand by all of them. I think the show's very proud of it. And I actually want to end on two points here. One is that I want to go back to this sort of idea of inspiration and what shows we're listening to. I don't know that this is the right language to describe what's out there in podcast land, but probably the most common show format is edited long-form interview. 2 people get on a microphone. Every time it's a different guest, and that format, I think, can be great if you are an exceptional interviewer, but there's really not that many exceptional interviewers out there. So that format, which I've done a lot of and I'm a fan of, can be a total grind. Narrative is sort of, a lot of work. It's a greater experience, but these shows tend to be very expensive. I've been thinking a lot about, one thing I really want to do, for the community is open up Famous and Gravy as a kind of case study. 1, for attracting a media partnership, but 2, really for creative development. So I've been using this phrase, designed conversations. I don't think that is necessarily its own kind of format, but here are 6 shows, all of which I'm a fan of, that for the most part do not rely on interview tape. And there are real advantages to thinking about the show in this way. First of all, it's streamlined. Segments allow you to signpost where the edit points are, how long a segment has to be in a given show. So you can add high production value at low production cost. And I think that kind of solves one of those problems that I highlighted at the beginning of the talk. How do we make an awesome show at low budget? Think about segments. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I mentioned this earlier about the revised Vanderbeek. Here's why you want this life. Listeners want to know how they're going to feel before they hit play. So how do you build that into the structure of your show? Maybe it's a ending segment, or maybe it's an ending question with every episode. I think it's a really important consideration. I've heard people describe it as the peak end rule, that if anybody asks, how was that podcast? They'll remember the peak emotion and they'll remember the ending emotion. I think that all of these shows have in common a very clear driving question. There's a real original why of the show. I would even go so far as to say all of these shows are making a novel argument. And that's certainly something we're trying to do on Famous and Gravy, is present a different point of view, that you can take the same set of events of a celebrity's life and you can come to a very, very different interpretation. That is the podcast level argument of the show. At the episode level, we take people like Aretha Franklin and Fred Rogers and we've done about 120 of these at this point. And then at the category level, we probe at that question, things like net worth and coffee, cocktail, cannabis. Which one would you want to do with them? What is it like to hang out with these people? All right. And then probably the most important thing is, like, you can get off the grind of, like, who am I going to put next? What am I going to talk to them about? What is this episode going to look like? This idea of a designed conversation doesn't rely on the administrative time costs that come with interview tape. So personally, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in podcasting around some sort of designed conversation theme. And then I do think that your segments, and you still need structure, and you need to be telling a story. Those ideas I mentioned earlier, that every show begins with, or every great show has story, something you learn, and hangout space. I mean, be rigorously honest with yourself about whether or not you're bringing that in. Okay, I got this friend, Steve, who every time a middle-aged man every time I get vulnerable, he's like, Michael, are you going to have a wiener dog moment? So this is my wiener dog moment I think it's a funny term, to end the show. I hope all of you wind up getting a media partnership if that is your dream. I hope you wind up having great, glory with your podcast. But for me, the reason I do this is that this is an act of self-love. I love putting together every show I've ever worked on. I love every part of the process. I was reminded of this on the most recent episode we put out with Richard Simmons. Self-love matters. If your podcast is not filling your cup, then you're never going to get a media partner or get to profitability. This ought to be for you at the end of the day. That's my wiener dog message. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it.